Short stories are about loss. They're about lonely figures cast in unremarkable situations made remarkable or extraordinary situations made ordinary. It doesn't matter where the stories occur or if there's a little thread of surrealism tying things together and exposing more fully what is all too real. These enthralling insights about loss and the human condition are precisely what we find in the exciting debut collection titled Land of Big Numbers by Chen. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Twins who take divergent roads in life that lead to unexpected and ironic places. A woman who works at a government call center and suddenly receives a call from a violent ex-boyfriend. A group of people who sit trapped for months on a subway platform for no known reason, waiting for permission to depart. An amusement park ride designer who becomes obsessed with an ordinary woman and takes over her apartment until things take a strange and terrible turn. These are the people and situations you'll find in Land of Big Numbers. I spoke to author Chen about her new story collection. This is a collection of 10 stories, but what do you tell people when they ask you, what's the book about?
I tell them it's about men and women in love and robots that make noodles and rural inventors and all kinds of big ambitions and dreams. And, of course, about China.
Yeah. Well, what is your relationship with China, where many of the stories in this collection are set?
Sure. So I was born and raised in California, but I'm ethnically Chinese by descent and spent many years in China as a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, mostly in Beijing, and spent a lot of time traveling the country and meeting and talking to a lot of folk. And yeah, seeds of which are scattered throughout the book's pages.
Do you feel like there's something about China in particular that was conducive somehow to that transition from reporting and writing journalism about China to writing fiction about the Chinese and China? And of course, here I mean fiction as a genre, as you know, that tells the truest truths, right? So what was that sort of transition like for you? Is it just kind of a seamless thing for you?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that China is a place that is so larger than life in many ways and over the top and extraordinary and propulsive and vivid. And it's a place that I think as a reporter, you know, even though my day job was writing about the country for the Wall Street Journal, it also just felt like a place that I was only ever able to really capture a fraction of through headlines. And so for me, I mean, I think it was really a seamless kind of thing to answer your question. It was a feeling of having spent so long in a country, observing and taking notes and talking to people and feeling so powerfully and urgently that there were so many stories that I wanted to tell. And fiction seemed like, you know, in some ways the best way to do it, just a larger canvas. And in the case of this collection, you know, a series of 10 short stories, so different canvases, and trying to assemble this world for readers that I think from an outside perspective, it can just be so hard to get a window onto modern China. And I think what I hope Land of Big Numbers does is pull readers into this world, which is just so vivid and in some ways, you know, I think surprising too for readers who've mostly encountered it in maybe a headline context. Just it's a place where I think there is a lot of humor and unexpected beauty that can also be found. And many of these stories, which I mentioned, robots who make noodles, other sorts of details like that studded in the collection. Readers also will encounter funeral strippers, which was one phenomenon, a real life phenomenon that I encountered as a reporter and just thought was so compelling and just surprising and arresting of a detail, these in which someone dies and you want to ensure good turnout for the funeral. And so one way to do so is to invite a stripper. And so for me, as a reporter, I was constantly trying to build up my understanding of this world and trying to share it with readers. And yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, a lot of what you see is very much the product of the same sort of instinct, right? Of just being struck by what I was seeing and wanting to share.
What I kept encountering in the stories was this sense of the funeral strippers, or something that was a little bit out there, made accessible. And then the more ordinary, just everyday people being sort of treated as extraordinary things. So there was like this very interesting paradox with the characters that I just fell into. And I kept thinking that embeddedness of yours, it couldn't hurt, right? But do you remember like a moment when you're in China and you're a reporter, when you just thought this would make a great story? Was there one moment like that, and then the stories in the collection now?
Yeah. I mean, I truly feel like it was so many moments, right? And I think a lot of it stemmed for me, in many ways, the desire to write this collection was also it came from a place of meeting so many really extraordinary people who I think some of the spirit which animates, these stories is, it's everything from a character like Lulu, from the book's opening story, which features a pair of twins, one who becomes a professional video gamer, and his brilliant sister who ends up actually becoming an online sort of dissident and activist. And to ranging to stories like that of, I mentioned Real Inventors, like a farmer who decides to build an airplane. Just all the spirit of a lot of folk, which I encountered in China as a reporter, and also just in daily life, when, people who are just incredibly creative and tenacious and striving in all kinds of different ways to make a mark for themselves, and, to create a sense of meaning for themselves. And I think that for me was really what most inspired these stories, was just feeling like that was so important to capture, right? I think from a distance, we often think of, when we think of China, we think of the government, we think of the Communist Party, and we don't tend as much to think about the people, and quite naturally so. I think it really is hard to get an on the ground sense of the place and the people, and of course getting harder too, with China having recently kicked out a number of American reporters, including my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. So yeah, I mean, I think it was really a feeling of just in so many ways hoping to try and capture in some of these pages some of that spirit, which just struck me so much when living there.
Well, you mentioned the story Lulu, and this is a story that appeared in The New Yorker in 2019, I think, to a great reaction from a lot of people. And it is about these boy-girl twins. So full disclosure, I'm a twin to a boy. So I love the story for many reasons. But Lulu's twin brother is the first person narrator, and he reveals so much to us about the relationship, but mostly like the mystery of it. He says, for the first few weeks of our life, our skulls had matching indentations from where they'd been pressed against each other in the womb, like two interlocking puzzle pieces. Later in life, when we were apart, I'd sometimes touch my hand to the back of my skull when I thought of her, as if seeking a phantom limb. Nailed it. So it is a little like, like that, like these interlocking puzzle pieces and this sort of phantom limb, even with fraternal twins. So the sister, Lulu, is that puzzle. He just can't figure her out. For as much as he tries to sort of like sniff out clues and internet stalk her, and it sort of seems like, oh, he's going to know everything about her, but she remains just this enigma. At first, what I love about the story, it seems like she's the favored one for whom life is going to be really easy and things will not be as easy for him. And, and folks need to read the story if they haven't so far. But there's just something about this story that is not just about the mystery between twins, but the mystery of our own lives when we think we have so much control over what can possibly happen to us. And it's not Chinese particularly. That's the other thing about the stories is that they are so universal. Even if something distinctly Chinese is sort of happening, and I'm thinking about the train story, but or even like the hotline story, but there's this other aspect of it that is just all too human and resonant.
Yeah, no, I think that's so beautifully put, and I'm so happy to know that you took that from the book, because to me, I mean, of course, the stories are literally set in China, a number of them, or in the States, featuring Chinese characters. But I mean, so much of what animates the stories, and just like you identified Lulu, is this question of just like what it means to be human, and to know other people, or and we see, as we see in Lulu and in other stories too, to not know them, the ways that in which we misunderstand each other, even those we think we know most intimately and love so deeply, our family members, our people that we're in relationships with. I'm thinking of one story which features, that couple on a road trip through Arizona, one of whom is a member of the Chinese diaspora, in a long-term relationship with a man, and who she loves very much, but is well aware of his flaws, and finds the lipstick a lipstick that doesn't belong to her in his car, and knows it means something, and yet doesn't want to confront it. And all the ways that I think, again, we in some ways are seeing past each other, or we see shadows of each other, and are always sort of trying to resolve these questions, and sometimes more completely than others. And how that sense of just beauty and longing that comes along with that journey of trying to understand each other and ourselves.
Yes. And I'm thinking about both New Fruit and Hotline Girl, which I mentioned before. And some people conceive of China as a kind of just one thing, a monolith, without considering the diversity or even the individual and individual stories. So in a story like New Fruit, for example, we see that diversity, even though it's sort of like there's this cavalcade of people all eating this fruit, and everybody sort of, being enraptured with the idea of this new fruit. And yet they each have an individual reaction to it and an individual story around it. And then in a story like Hotline Girl, maybe everyone thinks they know what life can be like in a work environment like this, where the protagonist, Bai, is. So she's an operator in a government helpline office, and she falls in line with the expectations of using the script, these pre-scripted responses to the people who call in. But she is a living, breathing, thinking, feeling human being who's in a really complicated situation. Even if we see it on the surface as like this young love relationship that went wrong, it's not that. Like, these are some really complex issues she's facing with the character of Keiju. So there's this idea again of China as a place maybe we think we know, or we think we know what's going to come to the fore of the story. It's like this very typically Chinese thing. And it's a very human thing, So I think your stories do so much to sort of cancel out like this superficial understanding about China for so many of us who have never been there and maybe can't really know some of these things. And yet what we come away with too is that we're all the same. Like, we are more alike than we are different. And there's a real beauty in that.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear you say that. Yeah, and speaking of Hotline Girl, I mean, that's one story where I know some readers have been really surprised by, that the setup of that story. Yeah, so a young woman who's working in this government satisfaction center, a call center dedicated to fielding citizen complaints, right? And that's something that is maybe a little bit surprising to run into as a detail, but is actually very true to life. I mean, I think, again, from distance, people think of China as, 1984, a society where like the government is impenetrable, or just like a really heavy hand. And what that story is so much about is, of course, a young woman who's trying to find a way and, has had ambitions, ends up working in this kind of government bureaucrat job. And then all of a sudden has her ex-boyfriend calling the center where she works. But it's also a story that's so much right about, how repressive society actually functions in many ways, and how it's possible for a young woman like Bai to end up in so many ways being not only comfortable but also complicit in some ways, even when, of course, her function is at odds with some of these ambitions she'd had as a younger woman. And yeah, I mean, I think all of those questions are ones that I was wrestling with when I was writing the book.
You write in such a classic mode, and it's for me, it's a style that's, I'll just say it, don't be embarrassed, but it's a style that's kind of reminiscent of the masters of the form. It really put me in the mind in some moments of like Gogol. So,
oh my gosh, that's so kind of you.
But of course, I mean, the characters are in these contemporary settings. So in the story On the Street Where You Live, and I was so interested in the story. It takes its title from this Victim Own song from My Fair Lady, and it's set in the United States. And our first person narrator is someone who designs like amusement park rides.
Mm-hmm.
And he's narrating from the beginning from this jail cell where you get the feeling that he does not belong there. He's so out of place there until you keep reading and you wonder if he might not be better suited someplace where he can get some help. But he seems so reasonable and so, just like, a really normal guy until not so much. But from that vantage point, as this narrator, he gets to tell us. He's in control of the story, and he gets to tell us what's wrong with this lovesick Perry, who is obsessed with Lizette. And then we start to see the narrator as the one who's a little bit off in his preoccupations the more he talks. And he does reference Eliza Doolittle, right? It's just this unusual story, but unusual is not the right word. It's a remarkable story in this collection where we see that Chinese or American, our sense of loss or of loneliness is really the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. He's a character that, of course, is very different from who I am. I mean, he's part of he's just like sort of the global cosmopolitan educated elite, right? Rootless and washes up in Atlantic City and has this job and, this passion for old Hollywood and the romance. And, it's ultimately just this really unsettling character. But I found so much of him really empathetic in the writing of it. I mean, just the way, I mean, his almost sort of naive love for certain aspects of American culture, and of course his incredible passion for this woman who the reader can see quite well doesn't match what he's feeling. And I just loved getting to inhabit this very particular and strange mind that's so different from mine, but as you say, like so relatable, even as the reader sees him do, just increasingly comes to understand that he's a discomforting sort of individual from that the reader gets to see and understand as just as an increasingly discomforting figure, one who moves into the apartment vacated by this woman that he has a crush on, and goes to the Goodwill and buys some of her old possessions. Just the growing awareness of how unsettling of a character he is, but at the same time, as a writer going along for the ride with him, it was just still being able to feel like he was really relatable up until the end, which was a trip for me and hopefully for the reader too.
Oh, the details are just amazing. I kept wondering, like, where did this guy come from? And it's sort of like Lizette. Wow, Lizette with what was the description? The sugar cookie, the unrolled. Yes. Oh my God, that was it. I could so see her hands. And it's sort of like Perry and the main character both are are taken with Lisette, and Lisette's over here trying to find herself and figure out a bunch of other things that we are not privy to. She remains a bit of a mystery to us, but she's this character who just makes everybody crazy in her ordinariness. Of course, it makes perfect sense. And he has this really interesting line. It wasn't until we actually became friends that I realized she was often very sad. America is like that, I must say, free and easy until you know better. And I underlined it, and I just thought, I know. And it is true about some people that you meet. So it was just so insightful. He's just like this incredibly insightful character, and we trust him, and we're just listening to the story. And then he tells us that he goes back to the Goodwill to buy her, her dish towels, and we're like, all right.
Yeah, you keep extending the benefit of the doubt, and you're going along right with him until the end. Yeah, and even at the end, like, how to feel about him, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an open question.
It's a great story, and it's a wonderful story. I feel like you must just love to write, and you must have just had this same sense with reporting. So I was curious about what you miss about reporting, and then what you love about writing short stories that just makes up for that loss.
Yeah. Well, I should be clear. So actually, I still am working as a reporter. I still am a full-time reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And actually, when I was writing these stories, I was full-time with the Journal too. So I would start my days in the morning writing fiction, and then I would bike to the bureau and write in a very different kind of genre. But, as I mentioned, I do see the two as having worked very much in tandem with, in the morning going through the local papers and the headlines and seeing them almost as writing prompts in some ways, ideas for stories. And as we talked about, there are definitely places where bits and pieces that fell out of maybe stories from the newspaper might have landed in some of these fiction pieces, though, again, it might be something as small as like a gesture, an expression on someone's face of someone I interviewed, or something, like bigger and substantial that ends up as a plot point, like Funeral Strippers. But yeah, it was really, the two I found really spoke to each other. And for me, I think also just like the discipline, especially of working in journalism, of, that incredibly tight compression of the writing and needing to carve away and perpetually carve away. And also just think all the time of like audience and what do people know, and always reducing things to, really what was essential and timely, and so for me, like getting to write fiction was just this like expansive experience of getting to luxuriate and really revel in all these details of life that I really just, they just seem so incredibly vivid and just demanded to be set down, even if it wasn't always possible in perhaps a newspaper context.
I get the feeling you have so much fun writing the short stories.
I did. Yeah.
Creating these worlds.
Oh my God.
That's really awesome.
Hopefully, hopefully the reader feels that. I'm so glad to know that came across to you.
It is very much like that with these stories, because you sort of, you finish Lulu, and you can't even imagine like what can come next, and then there's the next one, and then there's the it's just, and it just builds, and it's just an incredible world. So, well, back in China, we have a story like, and help me pronounce this. Is it Gubeku Spirit?
Gubeku Spirit, yeah, you got it.
Okay. So we have a story like Gubeku Spirit, which it's an unusual story, but with this verisimilitude that makes it all too real and realistic. For that reason, it's just a really haunting story. This idea that there's a train that's running late, and the passengers are waiting for it, and they're not allowed to leave. The guard says passengers must exit at a different station from where they entered because those are the rules. And they're unmoved by the passengers who are trying to escape and who seem really desperate at the beginning to get out of there. And then over time, the passengers just accept the situation. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see it. I really didn't even think while I was reading. This has just come into my head as I'm asking you the question. Of a story like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, one of these stories where you just sort of accept your lot in life and what's about to happen. It's different. It's a really different kind of thing, and yet it's sort of grounded in this idea of the way, and not just in China, but the way that we just sort of fall in line with certain parameters or certain expectations. And I'm thinking about the pandemic also, right? The things that we have to do as a society to take care of each other. Mm-hmm. But that story I was thinking this may have come from a sort of a reporter's experience. Is that the case?
I think, in as much as I was living in a society where I was really struck by just what you observe, I think we know to be true very much from our experience here in the US of the pandemic, just that things can be demanded of you and things can change in really dramatic ways, your circumstances, and human nature is such that it can become normal. You can acclimate readily. And I think in different contexts that can be inspiring on the one hand, just this resilience of the human spirit and our ability to band together and form community as we see in this story. But also in other contexts, as you can see in a country like China, also quite terrifying in some ways, the implications, right? To live in a society where so many things are dictated for you and unjust, and where you're surrounded by so many acts that, say in a case of the story, Lulu, people like Lulu are rightfully really disturbed by, but at the same time, how normal it can come to seem and how quickly people can turn acquiescent. And so, that story is, of course, very literally about subway commuters stuck on a platform for months, but ends up, I think, becoming sort of a darker fairy tale about what it means to be a human, living in society where things are not quite right.
I think you have, and maybe we'll have many more readers of these stories realizing that we all, as we read, we make assumptions about China, and that there's a lot to learn about human nature, as you say, and about how much alike we are in our loneliness and in the small things that bring us comfort and happiness. Mm-hmm. What's been the driving force for you with this collection in terms of, even as you maybe do these virtual sorts of readings, or even as you were writing the book, what was the driving force for you of what you really wanted readers to begin to understand and appreciate about China and the Chinese?
Yeah. I think, it's funny to think of readers because I never thought that the book would be published. And so it was, I couldn't really count this idea of readers because, again, it just seemed like not quite possible. And so for me, it's really, I was just writing the stories for myself. And so it was the feeling of feeling like I had the really rare privilege to be a reporter in a country that is, especially I think as a reporter, very, very hard to access, and feeling constantly struck at the surprises and absurdities and over-the-top extremes of humanity and politics and everything in between, and just constantly being struck by that and wanting to share it and preserve it in some ways, to write it down and to try. And also, I think, for me, I think also it was a feeling of wanting to capture that sense of beauty too, that and surprise and wonder that comes in living in the country, that I hadn't really seen replicated elsewhere. That seemed, as we were talking about, some of the characters in this book and some of the spirit that lies behind characters like Cao Cao, that farmer who wants to build an airplane, or a woman like Lulu. Just that that really struck me as something to celebrate and something to try and evoke and share. And so I think that for me it was like the equivalent of just like looking around and constantly, if I'd been a documentarian, or I would have, taken out my camera and filmed. Or a better photographer, I would have taken better pictures. But as it was, as a writer, I mean, all I could do was, right. And it was in some ways almost like a bit of an exorcism for me. I think having spent many years in a country that can be frustrating, can be hard, and wrestling with some of these questions that we talked about. But over the course of my living there, really coming to love the country, to fall in love with the country in many aspects of it, even, amid all of the frustration and sadness that comes with living in the country and being a reporter there too. And so, yeah, all of those complexities I experienced, wanting to put it down on a page and try and find beauty in them.
Teping Chen, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you so much for having me on.
Teping Chen is the author of the story collection, Land of Big Numbers. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Kathleen Creedon is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.